Hello, and welcome to the International Joint Commission's report release and news conference for the 2023 Third Triennial Assessment of Progress Report on Great Lakes Water Quality. You will be hearing about three important recommendations in this report that the IJC is formally making to the governments of Canada and the United States. I'm your host, Sandra Swoboda, and I'm with the IJC's Great Lakes Regional Office in Windsor, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations. First today, a little bit about the event here. As the IJC is a binational commission, well, multinational really, we are offering simultaneous translation into French with a live interpreter. So let me provide some quick guidance for those wishing to listen to that. Pour écouter la version française, cliquez sur le globe Interprétation au bas de l'écran et sélectionnez Français. Pour entendre uniquement la version traduite, cliquez Mute Original Audio pour ne pas entendre l'original en arrière-plan. To hear only the translated version, find the little globe at the bottom of your screen with its interpretation label in the Zoom. There's a red arrow here on the slide pointing to it. Click there and mute original audio. If you do not select a language channel, then you will hear each speaker in their original language. And there are both English and French language slides today in our deck, and the French slides are available for download from the link that will be in the chat. Again, thank you all so much for joining us to learn about, as it's known by its acronym, the TAP report, Triennial Assessment of Progress. If you have not already downloaded the full report, you can find it at the URL on the screen here. It has information and recommendations that impact your community's water quality wherever it is around the Great Lakes. All right, let's get to today's agenda. First, we will share the full significance and mandate of the IJC's TAP report. Then you'll hear about those three specific recommendations that the report makes to the governments of Canada and the United States. We'll talk about the next steps now that the report is released and how you can find more information about the recommendations. We also hope this will prompt you to think a little bit about how you can be involved with actioning those recommendations across our shared waters. And of course, because this is a public news release event, including news media, we will have time for your questions, especially from the journalists joining us across the basin. So please include your news outlet with your question, if you don't mind. It's going to be a busy hour here, and as a reminder, we are recording this event. So, how you can be part of today's event. If you are live with us for this TAP report release and news conference, no matter which platform you're on, you can ask us a question today. If you're in the Zoom, please put your question in the Q&A function. It's on the bottom. We all know Zoom now. If you're watching on Facebook, please put your question in the comments as we have IJC staff monitoring that site. And if you're on our webpage or YouTube channel, you can email us at our dedicated TAP email address. That's on the screen, and that's tap-etp@ijc.org. If we don't get to your questions or you think of some later, you can still email them to that address. So the same goes for any of you watching this event at any time after our live version of it. So, with all of that done, it is now my honor to introduce our IJC commissioners. You can see them all here on the slides. Several of them will be presenting on today's call. We have U.S. Co-Chair Commissioner Jerry Acker to kick things off with some IJC and Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement context, and that will help explain why these recommendations today have such urgency and impact across the Great Lakes region. Next will be Commissioner Lance Yohe. He will share the significance of the recommendation related to Indigenous communities and traditional ecological knowledge. He will be followed by U.S. Commissioner Rob Sisson, who will discuss the recommendation related to climate resiliency. And finally, Canadian Commissioner Meryl Ann Fair will explain why a 10-year science plan, as the IJC is calling for, is crucial to our Great Lakes region. Enough from me. I will be back to field questions from all of you. On to Commissioner Acker.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm joining you all today from IJC headquarters in Washington, D.C., the traditional home of the Nakachank and neighboring the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. We are speaking today about the water quality of the Great Lakes, which are home to many Indigenous nations who have been stewards of these lands and waters for millennia. We are thankful for the many contributions Indigenous peoples have made to this triennial assessment, allowing us to deliver a much richer and fulsome report to governments Yes, we are here for the official release of the IJC's Triennial Assessment of Progress on Great Lakes Water Quality. The work you're seeing represented in this TAP report has origins going back more than 50 years when the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was signed. Our IJC heritage and origin story dates further yet, over a century plus in the making. I'll explain why this is important in a moment. And whether you're here in the event as a reporter covering water quality and Great Lakes environmental issues, or you're a policymaker looking for more and better information to help you develop and implement action plans, or you're here as one of our many dedicated advocates for the Great Lakes, I've met many of you, I hope this short history about the TAP and the IJC will help you do your work and understand how it's rooted in this unique binational partnership centered at the IJC. So let me share some background information about the IJC and why this report is so important. First, if this event is your introduction to the Commission, I'm going to quickly describe how we came to be and what we do. More than a century ago, the governments of Canada and the United States adopted the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. It's been called the world's first environmental agreement, and the language in it created the International Joint Commission with 6 commissioners. The commissioners are appointed by the highest level of government in each country, the cabinet in Canada and the US president, once confirmed by the Senate. We make decisions by consensus, and we work to find solutions that are in the best interests of both countries. The 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty also contains the principles and mechanisms for preventing and resolving any disputes involving water quantity and quality along our 2 nations' shared border. And while today we are focusing on the Great Lakes portion of this boundary, know that our border stretches some 5,500 miles across the whole North American continent. And some 40% of that length is water. So the scope of that 1909 treaty, still very relevant today, covers more than 130 rivers and lakes in our 2 nations and our tribal, First Nations, and Métis lands. The IJC is an independent advisor to the governments of the United States and Canada. That role, relative to the Great Lakes, was formally recognized in the Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was initially signed in 1972 and has been revised 3 times since then. Under the agreement, the IJC has the responsibility to produce the Triennial Assessment of Progress reports, which explains why we're here today. Overall, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement represents a commitment between Canada and the United States to restore and protect the waters here in the Great Lakes. You could say that the agreement formally recognizes the Great Lakes for what we all know them to be, an international treasure. Now, the IJC, as a binational organization, has offices in Washington, D.C. and Ottawa, Ontario. But the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement also created an equal branch of the Commission right here in the Great Lakes with the Great Lakes Regional Office. You'll meet the GLRO Director, Heather Sturrock, in a bit. That office is located in downtown Windsor on the waterfront with a view of my hometown of Detroit and the waterway in both directions. So symbolically, it's as binational as we can be. Also, we chose a Detroit River photo as the cover image for this TAP report. You saw it at the beginning of this event. It's an aerial view of the construction of the Gordie Howe Bridge, and it's meant to represent the cooperation our 2 nations undertake for the people and shared waters of the region. The GLRO, the Great Lakes Regional Office, is involved in many projects related to health, science, and water quality. And one of the biggest projects is this TAP report. In short, the TAP report are the government's progress to accomplish the agreement's goals and objectives. And the TAP has specific recommendations towards the goals of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. When you read the report, you will see all the materials and input that support the recommendations. In producing the TAP, we also particularly look at 2 government reports, the State of the Great Lakes Report and the Progress Report of the parties. The heart of the TAP is the 3 recommendations. Those are coming in a minute. I would especially like to point out to all of you section 3.3, which is entitled Progress Update. In that section, the longest in the report, you'll find a look at how the governments are doing and working towards the 9 general objectives of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. As you can see on this slide, that list is really a catalog of water quality goals for the Great Lakes. Many of you here in the audience have reported on these or worked on understanding and solving these problems. In that section, you'll find dozens of links to other reports and references that will help you in whatever Great Lakes related work you do, or this part will just provide more background information reading about the lakes we love. And you can see how well we're doing on each of the objectives. Now, on to the TAP recommendations. The Commission considers all 3 to be of equal importance, and the Commission thinks they have equal potential to help the governments of Canada and the United States strengthen their collaborative efforts. All of that work is aimed towards achieving the objectives of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Now, with more about that first recommendation, we'll hear from Commissioner Lance Yohe, and remember to please put your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Commissioner Acker. I'm speaking today from Fargo, North Dakota, the traditional lands of the Ochite, Shakoni, who are the Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota people, and the Anishinaabe people of this area. As part of this TAP report, the Commission recommends that the 2 governments collaborate with First Nations, Métis, and tribal governments as active partners in the review process of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And the Commission also recommends that this collaboration is part of any processes to change or amend the agreement. As Commissioner Acker said, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has had several revisions. It's meant to be a document that reflects environmental and ecosystem needs of the region as a whole. And as the 2 federal governments review the efficacy as is required during this triennial review cycle, deliberate collaboration is required with First Nations, Métis, and tribal governments. They need to be active partners in reviewing, changing, or amending the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Such cooperation is critical to ensuring Indigenous voices are involved on their own preferred terms. We want this deliberate collaboration to be transparent and done in a mutually agreed upon way. While the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has in it an expectation that the 2 federal governments, quote, take into account the views, end quote, of Indigenous people, the recommendation is that we should be going beyond this to partner further yet. We have seen efforts in recent years to further engage First Nations, Métis, and tribal governments and communities. Indigenous peoples are already on many committees related to the Great Lakes work done by the IJC, various governments, and organizations. But the TAP recommendation is a way of moving to include Indigenous governments earlier and more often in this work. As part of this recommendation, the IJC also supports the continuation of the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge into the parties' or government's work. We call this knowledge the Indigenous ways of knowing, and we have identified opportunities for the 2 governments to expand and the development of more culturally relevant policies and programs that are part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. I'll explain. Empowering First Nations, Métis, and tribes in this way would recognize their leadership and fill knowledge gaps toward those objectives in the agreement that we saw on the earlier slide. For example, Indigenous communities across the Great Lakes Basin have identified 2 types of information they would like more of: drinking water quality and fish consumption guidance. Traditional ecological knowledge would help fill these knowledge gaps when it's included in analysis and progress reporting by the governments. More information from Indigenous communities would also better support long-term planning for conservation and monitoring, as well as climate adaptation. At the local level, our distinct First Nations, Métis, and tribes have specific needs. Following this recommendation will help the 2 governments meet these needs. I look forward to your questions at the end. I'm also seeing questions coming in from the Q&A, so please continue to ask them. For the second recommendation in this report, here's Commissioner Rob
Thank you, Commissioner Yohe. I'd like to echo all of our speakers when I say thank you to everyone joining and all of you working on these topics. I'm a native of Southwest Michigan, home to the Potawatomi people, but I'm joining you today from Livingston, Montana. I'm here to present the recommendation in the 2023 TAP related to climate resiliency. It should not be a surprise that this report has a recommendation for government action related to climate resiliency, because this is an issue that is impacting all of us in so many ways. We hope this recommendation underscores the urgency of taking more ambitious action to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We know that the solution lies in climate resiliency projects of many kinds, and we hope that local and regional governments can find information here that helps them to prepare and implement climate resiliency programs and projects in addition to those that are already underway. This recommendation reads, in part, that the parties, the federal governments, should work toward common, basin-wide, and scalable climate resiliency goals. This should be done in collaboration with all levels of governments, regional watershed authorities, and others. And there should be transparent and accountable performance metrics and assessment processes. So what this means is that during the upcoming development cycle of the 5-year lake-wide action and management plans, the updated plan should include climate resiliency goals that reflect shared and basin-wide themes. These plans should be designed so that they can be suitable and achievable for a range of sizes and types of communities, from the largest coastal cities to our smallest villages on rivers upstream from the lakes themselves, like Sturgis, Michigan, and the St. Joseph River watershed, where I served as a city commissioner and mayor. And those plans should include performance metrics and work plans, for example, that show how each goal can be achieved. None of this is to say that the governments are not already addressing the impacts of climate change in our region. Much work has been done to identify, quantify, understand, and predict climate change in our region. Many of the ongoing watershed projects are improving restoration and protection and coastal resilience by considering climate change impacts on these natural and enhanced systems. This recommendation is calling for the federal government's continued investment and resource commitments to support coordination between multiple levels of government toward climate resiliency and adaptation. We have found that watershed-based planning and activities for monitoring and restoring watersheds and implementing coastal resilience are, at this moment, primarily the work of the state, provincial, and local governments. We recognize that the federal government's existing commitments to technical and financial assistance are critically important to support watershed restoration and coastal resiliency. But the responsibility for climate resiliency is still found at the local level. It deserves support. Think about your drinking water, your stormwater drainage for your home and nearby roads. Those are just two examples of how local and regional entities are responsible for the work that has the most and most immediate impact. What this recommendation says, in part, is that these smaller units of government, including watershed authorities, could be doing better work with a bigger emphasis from federal governments on coordination throughout the region. This would empower local work that impacts all of us in our homes and businesses, as well as all of the Great Lakes ecosystem. I look forward to questions now and over the life of this triennial assessment of progress on Great Lakes water quality. So please put them in the Q&A or email them to us. It's now time for our third recommendation. For that, we turn to my good friend from up north, Commissioner Marilyn Fair.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rob. I wanted to thank you all for being here today, to the people who are live on as we're doing this, but also future people, hopefully folks who are watching this as a replay. I'm calling in from Winnipeg, Manitoba, central Canada, and this is the homeland of the Métis Nation and also Treaty 1 territory. And so I wanted to start by recognizing that one of the things we heard the most in our engagement with the public on leading up to the TAP was the amazing treasure that the Great Lakes and the watersheds that they are within is to all of us. We know water is the foundation for life, not just personally, but also economic systems, our health benefits. But it's also, they create this sense of wonder, the sheer beauty of the lakes and the the spirit that is imbued in the lakes. I think we all feel this wonder and awe. We're in their presence. And so our third recommendation really focuses on building on this vast foundation of all the things that the lakes really provide for us. And what we're trying to do with this recommendation is focus on investing in the shared knowledge that we have about the lakes and building on that. So the idea here is collaborative science, and making collaborative science an underpinning of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. It already is, but we're trying to build that more strongly to build resilience. So here's the recommendation, is for the two federal governments to support and actively participate in the IJC Great Lakes Science Advisory Board, the collaborative process that's been set up by that board to develop a 10-year Great Lakes Science Plan. And the plan, of course, needs to be actionable. It needs to be detailed. You probably can tell from our other recommendations, we support strongly the involvement of Indigenous peoples, so First Nations, Métis, and tribes. But of course, all that might be involved in creating and actioning science plans. So that's academia, non-governmental organizations. Many of the people on this call maybe today would be interested in joining the effort of developing this. So what do we mean by a Great Lakes 10-year science plan? Well, really what it is it's a binational, really multinational, I guess, if you include Indigenous nations, which we do, system of science. And it includes monitoring, data management, data interpretation, knowledge sharing, and forecasting. But what we're really doing is talking about like, what could that do? Why are we focusing on those things? If we have a Great Lakes science plan, it helps us identify and predict threats that can happen to ecosystems and the communities that depend on them. If we can identify and predict, we can avoid. If we can't avoid, we can at least recover better. This is what knowledge gives us, and we need information to create knowledge. So what we're really talking about in the plan is, what are the details for this? How would we do this comprehensive kind of collaborative science? And so imagine a plan. It's about managing this. It's about funding it. It's about how would it be governed. It's about implementing it in a coordinated way. That's what the plan is about. That's what we're hoping. So second thing that a plan can do is, of course, it can help fill knowledge gaps. We currently have a bunch of them. In particular, just with the rate of climate impacts, our science is having trouble keeping up. And I think we need to improve that. That's what this is meant to do, coordinated. And it's really an idea around knowledge resilience. You build knowledge resilience through a plan like this. And so this would help us become more proactive in responding to these threats. As I said, we would have a state-of-the-art awareness of the health of the systems, and that helps us make better decisions. We're not starting from scratch on this. There's work that's already been done by the IJC through its committees and boards on developing the elements of this recommendation of this plan. If you look on the TAP webpage, you'll see that there's already, it's called the Great Lakes Science Strategy for the next decade. And we published that last year. It's got 6 priority areas for investment already identified to fill those gaps. And it identifies also priorities and resources for creating the integrated and actionable science plan that this recommendation is calling for. So it's building on that. And so with that, I look forward to your questions, and I'll turn it back to Commissioner Acker. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fair. And also thank you to Commissioners Yohe and Sisson for these overviews of the recommendations. Much work will be taking place towards them. And I'd like to introduce someone who can tell us a little bit about that. Heather Sturrett joins us now. She is the Director of the Great Lakes Regional Office of the International Joint Commission. Heather?
Thanks, Commissioner Acker. Thank you so much. I'm joining today from the traditional homelands of the Dakota and the Anishinaabe people in Minnesota. It's almost time for your questions, and we're really excited to garner those and also respond to them. Thanks for being so patient. I'd like to quickly remind folks that the 2023 Triennial Assessment of Progress on the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is the 3rd report in a series. All 3 of these reports have implications not only for the federal governments that we formally share them with, but also for all of you in today's audience and the people beyond those of us present today. I hope that the people reading this report, whether they are living, working, or visiting our region, will find a way forward for our shared Great Lakes waters in what this report recommends. We will be broadly sharing the 2023 TAP report with the Great Lakes related organizations and many other groups. And we welcome requests for presentations and interviews as you all go beyond the announcement of this report and into the details about how it can impact your work community and the audiences that you engage with. So with that, I will welcome back Sandra to walk us through the questions from those of you in the audience here today. Sandy?
Thank you, Heather. We have a couple questions, Heather. They're going to be coming your way. So I know you're not going anywhere, but we'll be back to you in just a moment. Thank you all so much for your questions. I want to get started right with the one that points to the first recommendation. So Commissioner Ayohi, this is for you. And we also have one of our staff scientists, Raj Bejankawar, on standby to help answer this question. So the question is about the first recommendation, and John is asking, as I'm looking at his question here, is your first recommendation meant to call for shared decision-making with Indigenous people? So Commissioner Yohi, and then we'll go to, as we call him affectionately, Raj after that.
Sure. Well, that's my interpretation of that is that we're recommending to governments to give consideration to all the options, including that one. And we want them to think about how we might do things differently as we're in a new century, and that would include those kinds of options. So we're looking for them to think of creatively of ways to include Indigenous without getting into the higher level of politics between federal governments and Indigenous peoples. We are looking for their expertise to help us move forward to protect this great resource.
Okay, and yep, we have Dr. Bejankawar on camera. So Raj, I'll let you follow up.
Sandra, can you repeat that question again? Sorry.
Yes, is the first recommendation in our TAP report, our Triennial Assessment of Progress, meant to call for shared decision making with Indigenous people?
Yes, I agree with the Commissioner Yohi. Couple of points. I think I don't think anybody like federal governments or agencies or IGC can think about making any decisions on the Great Lakes water quality or the ecosystem without this vast knowledge system that Indigenous people can bring on table. So I think it's a mute question in a simple way, but I think we are in a right track in terms of garnering those voices. I think this recommendation has really important value in terms of bringing Indigenous opinions and knowledge and their decision-making process. So I totally agree with it. So I don't have any further comments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. For reporters, if you need a title for him, he's a physical scientist, by title here at the IJC. Did anyone else here from the IJC want to follow up on that question? Okay, we will move on. As a reminder to those of you watching, we do have the Q&A box in the Zoom. If you have a question and want it answered, please type it in there and I will see it and ask it of our panelists here today. Okay, so our next question has to do with collaboration with the EPA. So we will go back to Heather for this one. It's the US EPA research vessel, the Lake Guardian, sails all 5 Great Lakes, collecting samples of water, sediment, plankton, and other aquatic life to determine the health of the ecosystem. So the Lake Guardian is the boat. I have a picture of it because one of the last times I was out on the lake, the Lake Guardian was heading north, and we have Mark Burrows on as well that can follow up about the Lake Guardian work. But Heather, the question now relevant to today especially is, does the IJC collaborate with the EPA, and how, especially in regards to their water quality monitoring program?
Absolutely, we collaborate with EPA and 16 other federal agencies on the US side. We also collaborate with ECCC and a variety of Canadian federal partners as well. Specific to the science vessel, I really like that example. IJC has been collaborating with EPA and all of those partners I just mentioned for some time now to really convene on an annual basis the coordinated science and monitoring work that we bring folks together to discuss what work will be done on each lake in that rotational 5-year basis. That is just one example. I would say there are many other examples of how IJC sits as observers on our annex and working group related efforts. And we also talk to our partners on a regular basis. EPA and ECCC, as well as those other entities, sit on our boards, for example. There's a lot of interplay, and I would suggest advice that goes between our various entities and help support the work most broadly under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Very good question. And I shouldn't fail to mention, we also collaborate with those entities through a group that Mark Burrows can speak more affectionately about, which is the Can-Am Glass Great Lakes Science Vessel Fleet. There's an annual, if not biannual, convening of that group where we get together and talk about the work that is ahead from CSMI's perspective, but also how our vessels can coordinate with each other. Obviously, those vessels at times need repair, or we might see other challenges that come up through the course of a field season. And it's just a great convening, a way of getting folks together and that they can lean on each other when they need to get that important work done.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Do we have Mark on here to talk very briefly about the Lake Guardian and the research vessel work related to water quality?
Thanks, Sandy. As Heather mentioned, I help coordinate the annual Great Lakes Science Vessel Coordination Workshop, which is sponsored by our Science Advisory Board Research Coordination Committee. And they sponsor a website which has a inventory of all the science vessels over 21 feet that are on the Great Lakes. It's at www.canamglass.org, and I'll put a link in the chat so that you can visit that to see a complete listing. But the one thing I did want to point out is in addition to that cooperative science and monitoring initiative that looks at each lake every year during a specific field season, the annual Science Vessel Coordination Workshop allows these vessels to network and to back each other up if there's a failure, or if a ship or scientist on that ship needs to get another data point and another vessel can cover it. It really helps them make the most out of those resources and help each other out. And there's over 94,000 square miles of Great Lakes, and maybe only about 20 or so large vessels, and many more smaller ones, but less than 100. So being able to back each other up is a really important thing. And I'd encourage everyone to visit the canamglass.org website and check them out. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. So for our next question from Jane, we are going to go to Commissioner Sisson as he presented the climate resiliency recommendation that is in the tab. So Jane, she has a little bit of an editorial comment first. She said, I love the goal of better goal setting and federal coordination on climate resilience. So here's the question, Commissioner Sisson. So if you want to answer, and then if we have any staffers that want to weigh in as well. How will this recommendation become reality in the federal government? And how, two parts, and how will the IJC help make it move from recommendation to action? Commissioner Sisson, we have you? Yep.
Yeah, we do. Well, Jane, that's kind of the $1 million question. And it's something the commission has spent a lot of time discussing. How do we move our recommendations into actual action or policy? And in the end, the IJC makes recommendations to the party, and we don't have the authority to order them to write checks or adopt programs. But we do have some accountability measures. At least twice a year, we meet with the directors of the Great Lakes Executive Committee. That is another entity formed under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Twice a year, we meet with the parties themselves at what we call our biannual or semi-annual meetings. And at that point, at those times, and in the communications leading up to that, we let them know what we're going to ask them for updates on. And these 3 recommendations we discussed today are 3 that we will continue to try to hold them accountable to move forward on. I don't know if any of our staff has a better answer than that, but that's my answer. Thank you, Jane, for the question.
All right, I will wait just a moment for our GLRO director, Heather Sturrett, to unmute. I think she wanted to follow up here.
Yes, I agree with everything you said there, Rob. I guess I would just also share, I think this is a great opportunity and time to say that we have a lot of other partners and we need to lean into the work that's being done at local government scales. So thinking about learning from our Great Lakes Coastal Resilience Study, which is just now funded and recently started, kicked off, underway. That's a state federal partnership moving forward. Leaning into the work that the Great Lakes Commission and some of our other interstate compact agreement and binational efforts underway. Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative is also doing a lot of very good work. In fact, they just passed a resolution this past summer around climate resiliency and really starting to lean in there with action plans at local scale. So there's a real opportunity for us to be working across, not only across the transboundary and across the various lake basins here in the Great Lakes watershed, but an opportunity to really be convening folks at all different levels of government and to work with them closely. I think most of us would agree that when it comes to resiliency, we need to think about it from a multidisciplinary approach, where we're thinking about it from the development of city and local government scale ordinances, policies, those types of things. And it's hard for the federal government sometimes to really drill down to that level of resolution unless we bring those partners along and work with them directly. So that would be my answer, Sandy.
All right, thank you for that. I want to go to another audience question. This one's from Bert, and Commissioner Fair, call on you to answer this and maybe give a little bit of background for people. We have people we know are registered for this webinar from really all over both countries. So especially for those from the United States who aren't familiar with the new Canadian Water Agency, maybe a little bit of a description of it, but also Commissioner Fair, Bert is asking, how will the IJC coordinate and collaborate with the Canadian Water Agency? Commissioner?
Yes, thank you. Great question. I love that question because the Canada Water Agency in Canada represents a real evolution in the governance of water. And I love the fact that it reminds us that things can change. Our systems can and need to change sometimes in order to work better together. And this is a key example of that. It was a commitment made a number of years ago by this, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago by the current federal government to create a Canada Water Agency. And a lot of work has been done by Environment Canada and other departments within the Canadian government to figure out what it could do and how it could do what it's potentially going to do. It's not yet created. The Canada Water Agency is in process of being legislated, I believe. Hopefully by the end of this year is what we've heard. And but a lot of us at IJC and many in the water community have been thinking about it for a long time. How could we work together? Because the primary kind of purpose, as it's stated very high level for the Canada Water Agency, is to create better coordination between governments. So federal, provincial, territorial, Indigenous governments. And part of the reason is no one government can go it alone when it comes to water. Nobody has all the jurisdiction. You can impact each other. And so we have to work together in order to actually properly manage water in a very sustainable way. But how do you do that, right? How do you actually coordinate governments to collaborate, cooperate, for the purposes of more sustainable water. That's the Canada Water Agency's key challenge. So we have weighed in on this. The Environment Canada had a broad consultation or engagement period where it went out to lots of folks. And so IJC sent in a letter where we had some analysis of what we thought could be a way that the International Joint Commission could assist the Canada Water Agency in the border regions. Because we don't step into what the domestic governments do within their territories, but they have agreed to collaborate along the border. So what role can we play in terms of that collaboration? And if you want to see the letter, the input we gave, we urge you to. It's on our website, and I think they've just put a link in the chat for you. And so there you can get some more detail about what we actually think. But it's under development. That's part of the very interesting conversation we're hoping to have over the next couple of years.
Yeah,
we'll keep you posted.
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Fair. Okay, well, let's stay on the sort of the theme of the governmental cooperation, because we have a question from Susan Bentz with Milwaukee Public Radio. So hello, Susan. Her question is, does the IJC plan to convene people at all levels of government to move these 3 recommendations forward? Heather Sterrett, I will start with you as the director of the Great Lakes Regional Office of the IJC.
Sure. So this is a deep and rich question, Susan. Thanks for posing it. I'm going to start with the science plan because that's probably the element that has the most meat on the bones in terms of our next steps and moving that recommendation forward. The IJC has just recently moved towards the development of a collaborative. That collaborative has about 30 members, and it is focused entirely on serving as an advisory guide for the work that we plan to do ahead. And that will be involving 6 or so different regional engagement sessions where we will in fact be bringing folks to the table to help us really think through what should be the content for this science plan, who should govern, how the money should flow, what are the priorities, specific priorities that we really want to focus on, gaps that we need to fill in our knowledge base, and how we really get out in front with this proactive posture that you heard Commissioner Fair speak about with regard to the science in this region. I think we've done an excellent job in responding to the restoration needs, which largely reflect on some of the faults that we have stumbled across in our past actions. We're really looking at the science plan as an opportunity to advance our knowledge and really put us out in front of some of those issues with a proactive posture moving forward. So that's the one that I would share right away. In terms of Indigenous engagement, the recommendation that we put forward there really does pass that responsibility back to the parties, since the next step with the delivery of this report would be for the parties then to reevaluate the agreement or to take another look at it. And so we'll be looking to the parties under the agreement to help us understand what their plans are for that next piece of the exercise. But I can say that from the IJC's perspective, we have representation on our boards that are Indigenous members. We are just now starting to explore a new collaboration that would have an Indigenous circle of experts that could be advising the Commission on all things transboundary across our various treaties and agreement mandates. And so that's another opportunity for us to lean into this recommendation more holistically. And then finally, I would just say when it comes to climate resiliency, there's a lot of work that's underway already through many of our boards here in the Great Lakes region. We have a Great Lakes Horizon project, which is looking at climate change scenario building and communicating those scenarios outwardly. So I would love to speak longer about this, but I want to give others to answer an opportunity to ask their questions. I think there's going to be a lot of examples how you will see us leaning into these recommendations going forward.
And Heather, you gave me an opportunity to follow that up with a gratuitous request, self-serving for the IJC in a way, but sign up for our newsletter, Shared Waters, as well as following us on social media. We do put these reports out for everyone to see and follow the progress. We have a question related to the third recommendation in the TAP report that kind of dovetails with this as well. This is from Emily. And we'll be having another of our staff scientists, Matthew Child, coming on to answer this. So the question is, how will the decadal science plan interact and work with large funding and planning work like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative? So Matt Child, I believe you're here. Could you give us maybe a little bit of overview on the science plan and how it works with the GLRI specifically for Emily? Do we have Matt?
Yeah, I'm here. If you can.
There we
hear me.
go. Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, great question. And there's good context provided in the TAP report itself, and Commissioner Fair and Heather have commented on the science plan itself. Over the last couple of years, the Science Advisory Board, through a series of engagements, including a number of U.S. federal agency and Canadian federal agency staff, did develop a Great Lakes science strategy, which is accessible on the Science Advisory Board website as a report. It developed 6 different investment priorities. These are areas that the board feels would benefit from a more intensive and expanded science program to better orient management agencies across nations towards the stressors and threats that the future will bring. The orientation of that science plan is to complement the existing work that governments are doing very ably to deal with many of the legacy impacts that we see from past practices, areas of concern, cleanup, aquatic invasive species, nutrients, and so on and so forth. And so that's a bit of context on the progress we've made so far. There were a number of online surveys and 3 workshops held in the development of that science strategy, and we were very grateful for the participation of staff from, as I've said, several federal agencies from both countries, among others. Moving forward, and in fact, we're just transitioning now to over the next 2 years, we'll be sharpening the focus of that science strategy to develop a much more detailed science plan. And that science plan development process will build on the progress we've made so far. As has already been identified, not only will we sharpen our understanding around the science gaps and needs to ready us for the future, but there'll also be careful consideration given to governance arrangements, how an expanded science program could be delivered on a multinational basis, and also what kind of investments will be needed. Obviously, that's a very important question to answer when an ask gets made down the road. The Commission at this point views its role as facilitating that discussion. We don't view the science plan as owned by the Commission. It is owned by a collaborative of agencies, organizations, and entities. And to that end, we have just in the last couple of months invited, and we're delighted to see the overwhelming interest in forming a collaborative to guide the development of the science plan. The first meeting of that collaborative will be next week. So it's all happening now. And through the guidance of that collaborative, we will be delivering on 6 major workshops and other convenings in the next couple of years. EPA is going to be represented on that collaborative, as will ECCC, and we have several of the other major federal agencies there as well, tribal and First Nations organizations, state, provincial agencies, a number of non-government organizations. So the lines of communication are open. We're benefiting from the exchange of insights and understanding of what's happening to better form an impression of what's needed. So I hope that's helpful commentary. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. That was Matthew Child. He is also a physical scientist for IJC, if anybody needs his title. I'd like to go back to Commissioner Fair. We have a question from B. Bishop. And let me just first say, I see a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm trying to pick the ones that are closest with the TAP recommendations. That's what our event is here today. If there are other ones in here, we will do our best to follow up with you on them and put related information to your question in the chat. So take a look in there if you've asked a question we're not getting to. But now Commissioner Fair, B, is asking, how can the IJC collaborate with the Canadian federal government to ensure drinking water quality within First Nations, that water adheres to or falls within the standard federal guidelines for drinking water?
Complicated question. Great one though. Yeah, because I've worked on First Nation safe drinking water stuff for most of my career actually in Canada, outside my IJC role. So I've got probably two ways I'd answer that. One is IJC is trying to collaborate directly with Indigenous nations, actually. We have a very strong focus on all the various ways we might collaborate along the border with Indigenous people through working on studies together, to them being members of our boards and our committees and things like that. So we like to collaborate directly. And the thing that is most important on this one when you collaborate directly is, first off, the knowledge that Indigenous nations have about how to best protect water, and the values associated with that, and all of the vast information. But it's also, we also want to work with them on source water. That's the overlap between First Nations safe drinking water and what we do, because we don't really, that's a domestic issue, right? But source water is the connection. If source waters are protected and governed collaboratively and worked on in a way that all parties' interests are protected, then we're doing our job, and that's what we were, asked to do. And so that's why First Nation collaboration is really important to us. But the second thing is the Canada Water Agency that we talked about earlier. So far, it looks like it's not going to have First Nations safe drinking water as part of its mandate, but it will have source water protection kind of as part of its mandate. And source waters are both on and off Indigenous community land, their treaty land, their titled land. You have to collaborate on that. And so to the extent that that issue is along the boundary, we see the source water protection and management issue as part of the way we could collaborate with both parties, actually, not just even the Canadian government, federal also, federal US also, and state and provincial. We bring them all together, and that's the conversation we can have. It's a source water protection issue. So that's what we're hoping to be able to do. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Fair. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to try to work two in, so we'll see how quickly we can get to these. The first one is from Jerome. He's asking about marine protected areas in the Great Lakes. So we'll go to Heather Stirrett. Are the creation of marine protected areas included as a way to achieve these recommendations in the TAP report?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sandy and Jerome. What a great question. I think that there's a significant focus around what we can be doing more of to protect our lands and waters in this region. And marine protected areas is a great opportunity to think broadly and to serve as a binational coordination component too between our two countries. So if folks aren't familiar with that term, marine protected areas really point to the notion of a network of just that, marine protected areas. I would say that there's lots of good examples that go at various government scales and how that's already being done across our region. It hasn't been networked together quite yet for the Great Lakes in particular. And I'll just use a couple of examples. NOAA's National Marine Sanctuaries Program. I believe we have Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, up in Lake Huron. And I believe we have the Shipwreck Coast Sanctuary in Lake Michigan. Those are great examples of how large segments of the Great Lakes can be protected. In those cases, on the basis of maritime heritage, but it also serves multiple benefits in terms of serving biodiversity, doing research and scientific analysis in those areas to better understand those systems and what those protections are really doing behind the scenes. We also have an opportunity to think more broadly than just marine protected areas. And I would say this is where we really need to acknowledge and recognize that land-water interface and the importance of what we do on land end up in our water. We really need to think about that more concertedly. So the opportunity to weave in biospheres and reserves and think about that as a component of what could be a networked system going forward. I think it's a really interesting notional idea and certainly would move us forward in terms of protecting those resources more intentionally in the future. So it's something I think that folks can be thinking about and considering. And you should also know there's a lot of good folks already working in those areas.
Yes, thank you, Heather. Jerome asked that question, and he's just one of those, with being the executive director of the International Association of Great Lakes Research. So let me squeeze in one more question here. I know we're nearly out of time, but I do want to get to this one. It's been touched on by a few people. So I will call back our physical scientist, Mark Burrows. For you, Mark, the final question of our event today is, will the beneficial use impairments in areas of concern under the Great Lakes Quality Agreement be amplified to include other issues such as PFAS chemicals? Mark?
I could that's a very good question. The Annex 3 subcommittee of the two parties that is under the Great Lakes Executive Committee has PFAS as a major focal point, and establishing limits, getting more comprehensive data set to establish trends and everything is a priority that's been talked about by the two parties in the progress report. It will be a focus for that Annex 3 subcommittee, but whether or not it would arrive or be included in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in a future update to the agreement remains to be seen. That would be part of the negotiations that the two parties do after every 3 triennial assessments of that agreement. So as Heather mentioned earlier, that agreement will be subject to review here after this report. So thank you. That's about all I can say about that.
All right. Well, thank you for leaving us with that, Mark, because what comes next is always what we want to talk about. And that was one good example of what comes next. So if we did not get to your question here, I do apologize. We'll be working in the coming days to get some of them online or answer them. There are some links in the chat that you can get to. I will repeat my small request of how you can follow the IJC's work and maybe get the answers to some of your questions and others that you have in the future. You can follow us on all the platforms, as well as with our Shared Waters newsletter. So I hope our event here and the report itself reflect your passion for the Great Lakes and our common personal attachments to their waters and the lands around them. So whether those connections come from our celebration of history or work towards the future, we thank all of you for the work you do, and we hope we captured it in the spirit of the TAP report. We will continue that spirit in the work that we all do towards the recommendations in this document. Thank you again for attending, and on behalf of all of us at the IJC, we look forward to working with you towards swimmable, drinkable, and fishable waters. Thank you.